I was there the night the Dowager Duchess of Ravenmere decided to ruin my best friend's comfortable solitude, and I will admit it freely. I did not see it coming. I am Lord Phineas Wickliffe, second son of the Earl of Moreland, and I have known Caspian Ashford, the Duke of Ravenmere, since we were boys throwing mud at each other across the lawns of Belmore Hall. I have watched him win 3 cavalry commendations, lose his father in the space of 1 terrible winter, and refuse 17 marriage proposals without once looking troubled about any of it. He is the most self-possessed man I have ever known, and I say this with both admiration and a certain amount of personal irritation, because I have never in my life been half so composed. What I have never seen Caspian Ashford do, not once in 31 years of close acquaintance, is lose his bearings over a woman. Until the night of his grandmother's autumn ball. I should tell you about Lady Sophronia first, because none of this makes sense without her. She is 82 years old, 4 feet 11 inches tall, and has never in living memory lost an argument. She defeated a Prussian minister of finance in a trade negotiation at the age of 60, once reduced a bishop to tears over the proper arrangement of altar candles, and has been running the Ravenmere estate with a hand of absolute iron since Caspian's grandfather was too ill to hold a pen. She is the only person alive whom Caspian genuinely fears, though he would sooner fall on a sword than say so. He calls her grandmama in a tone of careful respect. She calls him Caspian in a tone that makes clear she regards him as her finest and most exasperating project. She had been watching him refuse those 17 proposals with a patience I found frankly alarming. I understand now that she was waiting. I did not understand it then. The ball was held in late October at Ravenmere House, the great Ashford estate in the county of Westhaven. I had arrived 2 days early at Caspian's invitation, which is to say at Lady Sophronia's invitation delivered through Caspian, because she liked me and found my presence useful in what she called keeping Caspian from retreating into the library like a bear into a cave. She had 300 guests coming. She had 16 marriageable young women on her list, and she had, though I did not know it yet, a particular young woman in mind whose name appeared nowhere on any formal list, because her family had not had the standing or the money to appear on such a list for the past several years. I found out about this arrangement the morning before the ball, when I stumbled into Lady Sophronia's private sitting room looking for the decanter she kept on the corner table, and found her instead, perfectly upright on a silk chair, writing letters at a speed that suggested she was conducting several campaigns at once. She did not look up. "Close the door, Phineas. The draft from that corridor is barbaric." I closed the door. "I beg your pardon, Lady Sophronia. I only wanted—" "The decanter is in the cabinet under the window. Do sit down. I want to tell you something." She set her pen down with the precision of a general laying down a sword, intentionally, not in defeat. "I have invited a young woman tonight who is not on the formal guest roll. Her name is Miss Elspeth Vane. Her father was the Honorable Mr. Aldous Vane, a third son who married a parson's daughter and spent a comfortable fortune on horses. He died 4 years ago. Her mother remarried last year to a wool merchant in Dorset and no longer moves in these circles. Miss Vane herself is 18, has been presented to court once, and is counted by the wider world as entirely inconsequential." I waited. With Lady Sophronia there was always a second act. "She is also," she said, "the only young woman I have met in 6 years who argued back at me, did it correctly, and then apologized with complete sincerity and no trace of calculation." She picked up her pen again. "I intend to introduce her to Caspian." I looked at her for a moment. "You intend to match the Duke of Ravenmere with the orphan daughter of a spendthrift third son and a parson's daughter." "I intend," she said pleasantly, "to introduce him to the only young woman I believe capable of making him interesting again. What happens after that is between them and Providence. You may go, Phineas. Do not tell Caspian." I did not tell Caspian. He spent the morning of the ball reviewing his steward's accounts and the afternoon in the stables, and he appeared in the great entrance hall at 7 o'clock looking exactly as he always looked at formal occasions, tall, dark-coated, unreadable, and faintly impatient. Ravenmere House, when lit for a ball, is one of the finest sights in 3 counties. 600 candles in the chandeliers, hothouse flowers along every staircase, the whole marble entrance hall turned amber with light. Caspian looked at it, as a man looks at a field he must cross to reach the other side. 3 hours, he said to me under his breath as the first carriages arrived. I can manage 3 hours. Your grandmother will keep you until midnight. My grandmother can try. She arrived at the entrance of the ballroom at precisely 8:30, on the arm of a small, fair-haired young woman whose gown was 3 seasons out of fashion, and had been let out at the seam with thread that did not quite match. I noticed the gown because I was looking for Miss Vane. I noticed Miss Vane because she was looking at Caspian's grandmother with an expression of complete, unguarded terror that shifted, in the space of 2 seconds, into something that looked very much like resolution. She was not a great beauty. She was slight and pale, with dark eyes that were rather too large for her face, and a tendency to bite her lower lip when she was thinking. Her hair had been arranged by someone herself, I guessed, into something that was reaching for elegance, and had arrived at something merely earnest. She was the youngest person in the room and possibly the most plainly dressed, and she knew it, and she stood very straight anyway. Lady Sophronia brought her directly to where Caspian and I stood. "Caspian," she said, as though this were the most ordinary moment in the world, "this is Miss Elspeth Vane. She will be seated near us at supper. Miss Vane, my grandson, the Duke of Ravenmere." Caspian turned. He gave Miss Vane the same courteous look he gave everyone on formal occasions, measured, correct, not unkind. "Miss Vane." Miss Vane curtsied. Then she said in a voice that was rather steadier than I expected, "Your Grace. I should tell you immediately that your grandmother engineered this introduction, and I had very little say in the matter, so if you find it inconvenient, please don't feel obliged to maintain the conversation. I shall understand completely." There was a brief silence. I watched Caspian's face. I have known that face for 31 years, and I can read it the way a navigator reads water. What moved across it then was not irritation and not dismissal. It was something I can only describe as a man who has been in a room full of noise for a very long time suddenly hearing something quiet. "That," he said, "is the most honest thing anyone has said to me at one of these occasions in 6 years." "That is a low bar," Miss Vane said, and then looked immediately alarmed by her own words. "Forgive me, I meant only that." "You meant it was a low bar," Caspian said. "You were right, it is." He offered his arm. "Will you walk with me, Miss Vane? I find I am in no particular hurry to speak to anyone else." I looked at Lady Sophronia. She was already turned away, speaking to the Countess of Aldermere, one tiny silk-clad shoulder blade expressing satisfaction, so complete it was almost visible. I will not pretend I heard everything they said that first night, because I did not shadow them, and Caspian would have noticed and been annoyed. What I saw was this. They walked the length of the East Gallery twice. He paused before the portrait of his grandfather in his cavalry uniform, and she said something that made him glance at her sideways. They were stopped twice by guests who wished to speak to the Duke of Ravenmere, and each time he introduced Miss Vane with his full attention, as though she were someone whose name deserved to land properly. At supper she was seated to his left, and I was on his right, and she ate precisely what was in front of her and spoke when spoken to and did not once perform. That last part, the not performing, was what undid him, I think. Every other young woman in that room was performing. Miss Vane appeared simply to exist, with a quiet and occasionally disconcerting directness, and Caspian Ashford, who had spent years fending off performance, had no defense prepared for the alternative. I rode back to my own rooms at midnight and thought about Lady Sophronia, who had found the one thing in all the world her grandson did not know how to refuse. He called on me the next morning. Caspian does not call on people the morning after social occasions. He rides. He reads. He reviews correspondence. He does not appear at other men's breakfast tables at 8 o'clock looking as though he has been awake since 4, which he clearly had been. "Sit down," I said, pushing the toast rack in his direction. "You look terrible." "I am perfectly well." He sat down. He did not take the toast. "I am trying to remember," he said after a moment, "whether Miss Vane mentioned where she was staying." I put down my cup. "Are you asking me because you think I know, or because you find it easier to ask me than to ask your grandmother?" A pause, the second one. "She is staying with the Countess of Aldermere," I said, because Lady Sophronia had told me this, in the manner of someone who leaves useful information in convenient places. "Through the end of the month." He nodded. He was quiet for a moment longer, looking at the table. Then he said, with the air of a man making a report he finds mildly inconvenient, "She told me she had read my grandfather's memoir, the private one, not the published account." I waited. She said the published account was the performance and the private one was the man, and that she preferred the man. He looked up. She had found it in a lending library in Bath, which is not where one expects a private family memoir to end up, but there it was. She did not say it to compliment me. She said it because she thought I ought to know the difference between the two was legible to a careful reader, and that she thought I already knew it myself. I said nothing, because there was nothing useful to say. Caspian had spent the past 4 years since his father's death constructing the public version of the Duke of Ravenmere with considerable care, and in approximately 40 minutes of unguarded conversation, a girl in a refashioned gown had walked directly through the construction and noted what she found on the other side. "I'm going to call on the Countess of Aldermere," he said and stood up. "You've left the toast." "I don't want the toast, Phineas," but he stopped at the door. "Don't tell my grandmother, she'll be insufferable." "Your grandmother," I said, "already knows." He gave me a look of pure, defeated resignation and left. Miss Elspeth Vane, I learned over the following 2 weeks, had the following qualities in no particular order. She could discuss the Corn Laws with the precision of a man who had studied economics. She had strong opinions about the management of horses she was not shy about expressing. She had taught herself 3 languages from borrowed books and was working on a 4th. And she had a habit, when genuinely amused, of laughing before she could stop herself, and then looking mildly scandalized by the sound. She was not witty in the performance sense. She was simply honest, and honesty in that world at that time was so unusual it registered as something very close to dazzling. Caspian called on her 4 times in a fortnight. I know because I was present for 3 of them at the Countess of Aldermere's drawing room, where Miss Vane sat on a settee with the upright posture of someone who has been told all her life to take up less space and is quietly resisting it. He did not bring flowers. He brought the private memoir, recovered, he said mildly, from the lending library and set it on the table between them with no ceremony, and she looked at it and then at him, and he said, "I thought you should have a copy that wasn't falling apart," and she opened her mouth to say something polite and then said instead, "You are doing something kind and trying to make it look like nothing, and I don't quite know what to do with that." And he looked at her for a long moment and said, "Neither do I." "Particularly," and the Countess of Aldermere, who was pretending to read across the room, made a small sound that might have been a suppressed cough. I told Lady Sophronia all of this. I had decided by that point that she deserved to know how her campaign was progressing, and she deserved the full account. She listened with both hands folded around her teacup and her expression perfectly neutral, in the manner of a woman reading a weather report she had written herself. When I had finished, she was quiet for a moment, looking at her cup. Then she said, "He brought her the memoir." "He did. He has had that memoir in his study for 4 years. He has never offered it to anyone." She took a sip of tea, with the measured precision of a woman who does not rush any action she considers consequential. "That is the most romantic thing that child has done in 31 years. He would deny it if you said so." "Of course he would. He would say he was simply returning a family document to proper custody." She set down the cup. "That is also, incidentally, why I did not arrange this earlier. He needed to arrive at wanting it himself, without assistance, or it would not have been his. Arranged hearts are no good to anyone. The arrangement is only the room. The people must walk into it under their own power. I shall say nothing about it to anyone." She looked at me. "Phineas, I have been saying nothing about it to anyone since the moment I wrote Miss Vane's invitation. I am not going to begin saying something about it now." She said nothing about it to anyone in the sense that she arranged a second gathering, a dinner of 12, more intimate than the ball, at Ravenmere House, and placed Miss Vane directly across the table from Caspian, and then populated the rest of the table with people she knew would draw him out rather than shut him down, so that Miss Vane could watch him without the performance getting in the way. I sat beside Miss Vane at that dinner. I had decided I liked her, which felt important to establish. "He is very different here," she said quietly to me, at one point, watching Caspian across the table in a conversation with the old Admiral Pelfrith about, I believe, tidal charts. "At the ball he was present but controlled. Here he is just present. He is more himself in this house than anywhere else," I said. "And who is he in this house?" I considered the question. Someone who cares a great deal about doing things correctly, who finds the performance of not caring rather more exhausting than he admits, who is, when no one is watching, considerably funnier than his reputation suggests. She looked at me. You are telling me this on purpose. I am telling you this, I said, because my best friend has called on you 4 times in a fortnight, which he has not done for any person in any context in the 4 years I have known him as a duke, and I think you should have the full picture. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said in a voice that was very careful, I am not a suitable choice for him. I am aware of that. My mother married a wool merchant. My gown is 3 seasons out of fashion. I have no connections left worth speaking of and no fortune whatever. He could have, she glanced around the table, any number of women with all of those things. He has had the opportunity to pursue all of those women for 4 years, I said, and has pursued none of them. That is not the same as... Miss Vane, I waited until she looked at me. My grandmother used to say that a man who has never wanted anything in his life is the easiest man in the world to read, because the first time he wants something, he has absolutely no idea how to hide it. I nodded toward Caspian, who was, at that moment, listening to Admiral Pelfreth and simultaneously watching Miss Vane across the table with an expression of such careful, contained attention that it was visible from across the room to anyone who knew where to look. He has no idea how to hide it. She looked, she saw it. The color that rose in her face was entirely involuntary, and she pressed one hand briefly to her cheek, and then returned to her soup with great concentration. Lady Sophronia, from the head of the table, saw all of this, and moved no muscle in her face whatsoever. The difficulty arrived at the end of November, in the form of a letter. I heard about it from Caspian, who came to find me in the library of Ravenmere House with the letter in his hand, and an expression I had not seen on his face in years. The expression of a man who has recognized a problem he did not create and cannot solve by effort of will alone. He held it out to me without a word. It was from Miss Vane's mother. She was writing to inform her daughter, and, through channels, the Duke of Ravenmere's household, that she had arranged for Miss Vane to travel to Dorset before Christmas to take up a position as companion to the wife of her husband's business partner. The tone of the letter was not unkind. It was simply practical, in the manner of a woman who had made her peace with practicality and intended her daughter to do the same. There was a postscript that said, Elspeth, dearest, I know you had hoped the season might yet offer something, but we must be sensible. I read it twice, then I looked at Caspian. When does she leave? A fortnight, his voice was level, perhaps less depending on the arrangements. And you are? Thinking, he said. He sat down in the chair by the window that had been his father's chair, and he was quiet for a long moment. The light through the old glass was gray and cold, and he looked in it like a man doing arithmetic that refuses to resolve. She is 18 years old, he said at last. She has had 1 season. She is going to spend the winter in Dorset as a companion to a wool merchant's wife, and she will not complain about it because she does not complain about things. He paused. That is a considerable waste of a person. Yes, I said, it is. Another silence. Then, with the air of a man who has done the arithmetic and arrived at the only answer left, I am going to speak to her. To Miss Vane. Yes. About whether she would consider not going to Dorset. He said it flatly, as though it were a logistical problem. But his hands were very still on the arms of the chair, in the way that Caspian's hands went still when he was feeling something he had not yet given himself permission to feel. I am not going to ask her anything she hasn't had time to think about. I am going to tell her that I find the prospect of her going to Dorset extremely disagreeable, and that I would like very much to know whether she finds the prospect in any way disagreeable herself. I put the letter down on the table. You are going to tell the woman you have called on 4 times in a fortnight. 6 times. 6 times that you find the prospect of her departure extremely disagreeable. Yes. Caspian, I am aware, he said without moving, that this is not the conventional approach. It is not any approach, it is the least approach. It is the minimum possible movement in the direction of declaring. I know what it is, Phineas. He looked at me, and for a moment he was not the Duke of Ravenmere at all, but Caspian Ashford, my oldest friend, who has always preferred to do things quietly so that if they go wrong, the damage stays manageable. I don't want to overwhelm her. She's 18. I don't want to walk in there with the full weight of a dukedom and ask her to decide her future in an afternoon. I looked at him for a long moment. Then I said, Do you know what your grandmother said to me last spring when I asked her why she had never remarried after your grandfather died?" He shook his head. "She said, Phineas, the greatest mistake a person can make is to protect someone else from their own capacity to choose." I stood up. "Go and speak to Miss Vane. Tell her what you told me. Tell her plainly, and then let her choose." He was quiet, then he nodded once with the nod of a man who has come to a decision and intends to hold it. He picked up his coat from the chair. He left. I found Lady Sophronia in her sitting room 20 minutes later. She was not writing letters. She was simply sitting, with her hands in her lap, looking out the window at the November garden with an expression I had never seen on her before, not exactly serene, but something close to it, like the look of someone who has set a thing in motion that is now moving of its own accord correctly and can be trusted to arrive. "He's gone to her," I said. "I know." She did not look away from the window. "He came and told me first." I sat down. "What did you say to him?" "Nothing useful. He didn't need advice. He needed to say it aloud to someone who would not argue with him." A pause. "I told him I thought Miss Vane was a person of excellent sense, and that she would hear him clearly. And I told him the library was warm and the girl was brave, and that he had waited long enough. The library, of course she had arranged it. I waited in the drawing room. I am not accustomed to waiting, but there is something about a great house with its fires lit and its corridors quiet that makes waiting feel less like impatience and more like holding a breath the house itself is holding. I could hear nothing. Ravenmere House is stone through and through, and sound does not travel well, but I found I did not need to hear it. I knew the shape of what was happening in that room. I know my best friend. He would have sat down across from her, in the same manner he always sat, not stiff, but contained, like a man who takes up only the space he requires. He would have told her about the letter without pretending he hadn't read it. He would have told her, precisely and without decoration, that he found the prospect of her going to Dorset extremely disagreeable. And then, this is the part I know most certainly, because it is the part that is most essentially Caspian. He would have stopped and waited and let the room be quiet, and let her answer in her own time. What she said, he told me afterward, was this. She had been quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Your Grace, I want to be entirely clear about what you are telling me, because I want to answer you honestly, and I cannot do that if I've misunderstood." And he had said, "I am telling you that I would prefer you to remain in Westhaven, that I would prefer to continue calling on you, that I am aware this is not a conventional declaration, and I am not asking you to decide anything today. I am asking only whether you share, in any degree, my objection to you going to Dorset." And she had looked at him for a long moment with those dark eyes that were rather too large for her face, and she had said, "I share it very strongly, as it happens. I have been sharing it since the letter arrived, and thought I was not entitled to say so." And he had said, "You are entitled to say so." And she had said, "Then I will say it. I do not want to go to Dorset. I want to stay here. I want to continue this," a pause, "whatever this is." And he had said, very quietly, "I believe it is the beginning of something if you are willing." And she had said, "I am willing." That was all. That was the whole of it. Not a claiming before a shocked crowd, not a ring produced from a coat pocket, not a declaration made at an altar with a congregation holding its breath. Just two people in a library with a fire going and the November light failing outside, deciding together not to let the other one leave. I am told by those who prefer a grander shape to these things that this is a less satisfying story than it might have been. I disagree. I was there for all of it, or near enough to all of it, and what I can tell you is that the grandeur was not in any single moment. It was in the accumulation, a ball, and a direct apology for being introduced against her will. A memoir retrieved from a lending library. 6 calls in a fortnight. A dinner table, and a man who did not know how to hide what he wanted. And an 82-year-old woman who had seen all of it coming and had the patience to arrange the conditions, and then stand back and let the two of them find their own way there. Caspian told his grandmother that evening. He went to her sitting room after dinner and informed her, with the careful composure of a man who knows he is about to be right about something he finds mildly embarrassing, that he intended to call on Miss Vane formally, and with the object of a proposal, when sufficient time had passed for her to be comfortable. Lady Sophronia said, "Caspian, the girl is 18 and sensible, and she has just told you she wants to stay. I would suggest sufficient time is already passed." He looked at her for a moment, Then he said, with the kind of restraint that takes considerable effort, "Grandmama, did you know when you arranged that introduction that it would come to this?" She was quiet. Then she said, in a tone I had not heard from her before, not the tone of a general, but the tone of a grandmother, which is a different thing entirely. "I knew that you were lonely in a way that had nothing to do with company, and I knew that she was brave in a way that had nothing to do with circumstance, and I thought those two things ought to meet. The rest was yours to do." He stood there for a moment. Then he crossed the room, and he did something I have only seen him do twice in my life. He bent down and kissed his grandmother on the forehead. She patted his hand. "Go and write to her mother," she said, "and tell her the wool merchant's wife will have to find another companion." He married Miss Elspeth Vane the following spring, in the chapel at Ravenmere House, with no audience beyond the necessary witnesses, a handful of close friends, and Lady Sophronia, who sat in the front pew and watched her grandson put a ring on the hand of a girl in a gown that was new and well-made and properly fitted, and who wore the expression of a woman who has completed a campaign she began several years ago and finds the outcome entirely satisfactory. I stood beside Caspian. I watched him look at Elspeth Vane, Elspeth Ashford, from that morning onward, with an expression I had never seen on his face in 31 years of close acquaintance, an expression so private and so complete that I looked away, because some things are not for witnesses, even friendly ones. Afterward in the hall, Lady Sophronia found me at the table with the cake and the champagne, and the look of a man who is genuinely and uncomplicated happy for his best friend. "You arranged all of it," I said. "I arranged an introduction," she said. "He did the rest." "You arranged the dinner, the library, the—" "Phineas," she looked up at me with the small, precise authority of a woman who has been winning arguments for 82 years. "I arranged the conditions. I cannot arrange the feeling. No one can arrange the feeling. It was there or it wasn't, and it was there." She accepted a glass of champagne from the tray. "That is the only part that matters." I looked across the hall, where Caspian Ashford, the Duke of Ravenmere, the most self-possessed man I have ever known, who had refused 17 proposals without once looking troubled, was talking to his wife of 3 hours with a quality of attention that made everyone else in the room look slightly out of focus by comparison. "She is very young," I said, mostly to myself. "She is 18. Lady Sophronia said, and she corrected me twice in one conversation and apologized for it afterward with complete sincerity. "She will manage him admirably." I thought about Miss Vane at the ball, standing very straight in her out-of-fashion gown, with her expression of terror turning into resolution. I thought about the way she had said, without calculation, "I should tell you that your grandmother engineered this introduction, and I had very little say in it, so if you find it inconvenient, please don't feel obliged to maintain the conversation." The youngest debutante in that room, the plainest dressed, the one whose name had appeared on no formal list, whose family had no standing left, whose future had been arranged for her in the direction of Dorset and a wool merchant's wife. The one, as it turned out, that the Duke of Ravenmere had apparently been waiting for, without knowing he was waiting, and without anyone in the room suspecting it except his 82-year-old grandmother, who had suspected it from the first moment. She watched the girl argue back, and then apologize with complete sincerity and no trace of calculation. The right one, after all. I raised my glass to Lady Sophronia. She raised hers to me. Across the hall, Caspian Ashford said something quiet to his wife, and Elspeth Vane laughed before she could stop herself and then looked mildly scandalized by the sound, and he smiled, a real smile, not the managed one, and the room went warm in a way that had nothing to do with the fires. I have known Caspian Ashford for 31 years. I have never, in all that time, seen him look like that. It was, I will say without reservation, entirely worth being awake since 4 o'clock in the morning about.